In the closing years of World War II, as Allied troops advanced further into territories held tightly by Nazi Germany, a different kind of unit shadowed the front lines. This group didn't roll forward with cannons blazing or armored divisions grinding through enemy defenses. Instead, they moved silently, subtly, and with a very different kind of power. These soldiers, outwardly indistinguishable from the rest of the U.S. Army, carried with them not weapons designed to destroy, but tools meant to deceive. What they wielded was not lethal force, but imagination. With paintbrushes, loudspeakers, inflatable decoys, and clever scripts, they waged a war of deception against one of the most disciplined militaries the world had ever seen. This secretive and unusual unit came to be known unofficially as the Ghost Army, and its existence remained largely unknown for decades after the war. Their creation was not a spontaneous development, but the product of careful planning, vision, and precedent. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit was established in 1944, as the Allies were gearing up for the final climactic stages of their campaign against Germany. Unlike most combat groups, the purpose of this unit wasn't to engage enemy forces directly. Instead, their objective was to mislead them, to create confusion in the minds of German commanders, and to draw attention away from real Allied operations. Through an impressive and complex blend of artistry, engineering, and psychological insight, they made German troops see things that weren't there, hear armies that didn't exist, and believe they were facing attacks that were never intended to happen. The very idea that a war could be manipulated through illusions was both daring and innovative. Their operations were often mobile, changing locations rapidly to meet the needs of the advancing Allied front. This traveling deception team could change the outcome of battles not by firepower, but by clever misdirection. The concept for such a deception unit had roots in earlier British efforts, particularly in the deserts of North Africa. British military strategists, facing the experienced and cunning General Erwin Rommel, had turned to deception to shift the balance. Using dummy vehicles, fake fuel dumps, and carefully scripted radio chatter, they created the illusion of strength in places where they were weak and disguised their real advances with elaborate distractions. The success of these tactics didn't go unnoticed by American intelligence and military planners. They saw the potential for similar strategies in the more complex and varied landscapes of Europe. The American version, however, would be tailored to include more advanced sound technologies, more artistic freedom, and a stronger emphasis on mobility and adaptability. Recruitment for the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was anything but ordinary. These were not typical soldiers pulled from rural towns or city neighborhoods with dreams of glory on the battlefield. Instead, they were often recruited from art schools, advertising agencies, music conservatories, and theatrical companies. Many had never expected to wear a uniform, let alone serve in Europe. Some had backgrounds in commercial illustration, others in sculpture or theatrical set design. Radio technicians and sound engineers joined alongside painters and architects. Together, they formed a melting pot of creative talent, united by a mission unlike any other in the war. Among them were future luminaries of American culture, individuals who, after the war, would leave lasting marks in the world of fashion, art, and media. At the time, however, their sole focus was to create illusions so effective that they would trick even the most experienced German officers, protecting Allied soldiers from walking into deadly traps or being overwhelmed in vulnerable positions. The Ghost Army wasn't just one unified group. It was composed of different sections, each responsible for a specific type of deception. One of the most visually striking components was the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. Their job was to make things appear real that didn't exist at all. They constructed inflatable vehicles, life-sized replicas of tanks, jeeps, trucks, and artillery, crafted from rubberized canvas. These weren't toys or crude models. They were painstakingly designed to replicate the appearance of real military hardware from a distance. When strategically placed in open fields, near crossroads, or on the outskirts of towns, they created the illusion of a substantial military force preparing to engage or holding a defensive position. To enemy reconnaissance aircraft or even ground patrols, these setups looked legitimate and threatening. The effort put into their creation and deployment was immense. Soldiers would work in teams to inflate and position dozens of fake vehicles, sometimes even simulating tracks in the mud or tire marks on roads to reinforce the illusion. But visual deception was only one part of the puzzle. It was most effective when paired with audio deception and false radio traffic. These components would come later in the story, each adding depth and complexity to the Ghost Army's remarkable operations. The harmony between what the enemy saw and what they heard was crucial. If German scouts spotted tanks and then intercepted radio messages confirming their presence or heard engine sounds echoing across the landscape, the illusion became far more convincing. This careful orchestration of visual and auditory elements formed the backbone of the Ghost Army's success. The unit's work was dangerous. Though they weren't expected to engage in combat, they often operated close to the front lines or even behind enemy lines in some instances. If discovered, they would not be treated as ordinary soldiers. The deception they carried out could be seen as espionage or trickery, and they risked execution if captured. Yet they moved forward with remarkable courage, carrying out missions that required not just artistic talent, but nerves of steel and precise coordination. Their work saved lives by drawing enemy forces away from real troop movements, by convincing German units to dig in or retreat, and by buying precious time for the Allies to regroup, reposition, or strike elsewhere. This ghostly army may not have been officially recognized during the war in the same way that infantry divisions or airborne units were, but their contributions had a deep and lasting impact on the outcome of the European campaign. Their story, largely hidden from public view for decades, represents one of the most creative and daring aspects of modern warfare, a reminder that sometimes imagination and illusion can be just as powerful as bullets and bombs. As the Allied campaign progressed deeper into Europe, and the lines between success and catastrophe often blurred in the fog of war, the Ghost Army became increasingly vital. Their role evolved with each new mission, adapting not just to the shifting geography of battle, but to the psychological state of the enemy. The German forces were under immense pressure, facing a two-front war and the slow but steady erosion of their defenses. This exhaustion made them more vulnerable to deception, more likely to fall for illusions carefully crafted by this secret unit. But the success of the Ghost Army was not simply due to German fatigue. It was built on a foundation of ingenuity, experimentation, and the rare fusion of art and warfare. To enhance the illusion of military presence, the Ghost Army coordinated multiple layers of deception. They didn't just place dummy tanks in a field and leave. The scene was carefully choreographed. Soldiers would set up fake bivouac sites, complete with rows of empty tents, fake campfires, and even laundry hanging out to dry. In some cases, they painted mud on the tires of the decoy vehicles to match the local terrain, making them appear as though they had traveled through the region. Footprints and tire tracks were carefully faked. There were soldiers assigned specifically to walk in circles around the campsite in heavy boots, leaving just enough of a mark to suggest real activity. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail, from the angle of the sun hitting the side of an inflatable tank to the perceived mood of the local civilian population, was taken into account. To further reinforce their ruse, the Ghost Army made use of sound, a revolutionary concept in military deception at the time. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company, also part of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, specialized in sonic deception. These men worked with sound engineers to create realistic recordings of military activity. Tanks starting up, engines revving, trucks moving, artillery being loaded, and soldiers shouting commands. These sounds were then played through powerful speakers mounted on vehicles, capable of projecting the audio up to 15 miles away under the right conditions. The recordings weren't just static loops. They were layered and mixed depending on the terrain, time of day, and specific situation being replicated. If a convoy was meant to sound like it was crossing a bridge or climbing a hill, the acoustics were adjusted accordingly. This level of technical sophistication was extraordinary for its time. In addition to visual and sonic deception, the Ghost Army deployed radio trickery, which was just as crucial. Radio operators within the Signal Company Special used a method known as spoof radio to impersonate real Army divisions. These operators were trained to mimic the radio behavior of specific units down to their communication patterns, jargon, and timing. Every Army unit had a unique rhythm in how they sent and received messages. By studying these nuances, Ghost Army operators could create convincing radio traffic that aligned with the fake campsites and sound effects. To German intelligence listening in, it appeared as though a full division was encamped, preparing to move or launch an attack. The deception had to be seamless. If any one element was off, if the tanks looked right but the radio traffic didn't match, or if there were sounds but no visible activity, the entire illusion could fall apart. Precision and coordination were paramount. The success of these elaborate deceptions was measured not in enemy casualties, but in redirection. German divisions were often lured away from actual Allied objectives, forced to spread their forces thinner across wider fronts, or even retreat from areas where they thought they faced overwhelming odds. In one case, the Ghost Army's efforts convinced German commanders that 2 full American divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine River at a certain point. The Germans responded by reinforcing that sector heavily, pulling men and equipment away from the real crossing site miles away. As a result, the real Allied forces met with less resistance and were able to secure a key objective more quickly and with fewer losses. The Ghost Army's work was as much performance as it was military strategy. Some of its members described their missions as traveling theater productions, with the battlefield as their stage. They referred to their fake operations as shows, and like any successful production, they had dress rehearsals, cues, and improvisations. Creativity was not just encouraged, it was necessary for survival. When faced with unexpected terrain, weather, or enemy behavior, they had to adjust their plans on the fly. If the wind shifted and threatened to reveal that a tank was only a balloon, they had to think fast. If a group of curious civilians wandered too close, they had to act convincingly, sometimes even playing the part of soldiers from units that didn't exist, giving false answers to questions, inventing backstories on the spot. The blend of art and subterfuge created an atmosphere unlike any other military unit. Even within the broader Allied command, few people knew the full extent of what the Ghost Army was doing. Their operations were top secret, and their identity often cloaked in ambiguity. When questioned by other soldiers or officers who stumbled across their camps, they provided vague answers or simply said they were engineers or logistics personnel. They lived under a veil of secrecy, one that they carried long after the war had ended. For decades, many of the men who served in the Ghost Army were unable to speak about what they had done. Their actions were classified, their successes uncelebrated in public forums. It wasn't until the 1990s that the full story began to emerge, as documents were declassified and veterans finally felt free to share their experiences. The psychological toll of their missions was real. While they rarely saw direct combat, they operated in war zones, often surrounded by death and destruction. The knowledge that discovery could lead to swift execution hung over every mission. Some veterans spoke of the mental strain of pretending to be soldiers from other units, of maintaining a false identity while trying to remain unnoticed. Others described the surreal nature of building a fake army by day and listening to distant artillery fire by night, knowing that real men were fighting and dying while they played the part of ghosts. Still, they believed in the value of their work. They saw it not as deception in a dishonorable sense, but as a strategic shield, one that protected thousands of lives. Their contribution to the Allied victory cannot be measured in medals or monuments, but in the lives they helped save and the confusion they sowed in enemy ranks. The Ghost Army was not a force of destruction, but of disruption. They demonstrated that in war, as in art, perception can shape reality. Their legacy lives on not only in military history, but in the broader understanding of how creativity, when harnessed with discipline and courage, can change the course of human events.